Tonight we're going, because we're running a little late, we're going to pass on the reading of chapter 5. And we're going to go right to our reading tonight in the Language of the Heart. It's an article that Bill wrote in 1961. The article is entitled, God as We Understand Him, the Dilemma of No Faith. There's a lot in that title, by the way. It was, I believe, Henry Ford who said that when I hear it, I'm interested. When I see it, I believe it. When I experience it, I understand it. So the God of our understanding is the God we have experienced. And the experiencing of God in this program is a very simple matter in terms of the concept. One time after another, we take leaps of faith. We learn to do that as we work our steps. And whenever we do that, we find God working in our lives. And so we begin to experience God working in our lives. And it is the experience that leads us to our understanding. For most of us, except those of us who are of a religious bent and have been and sincerely believe some concept of God coming out of our religion, for the rest of us, the God that we understand is the God we have experienced. And that's when we talk about God, we talk about the God of our experience. And also that the dilemma of no faith, and this is really significant because without faith, we're dead. And as we go through the steps, what happens is that as we experience God work in our lives, our faith grows. The more we learn that we can trust God, the more our faith grows. And it is faith, of course, which ultimately results in our being able to live our lives basically free of fear. And so the dilemma of no faith is the dilemma that we all face as we come in. One of the hallmarks of our disease is spiritual bankruptcy. Let's go over on page 253. We're going to pick up there. On page 252, the Big Book is talking about what happens with newcomers when they are approached by and bedeviled by those who are operating out of spiritual cocksureness and spiritual superiority. Now, Bill knows whereof he writes here, because in the beginning, when he was first starting to try to spread the word and get people to follow him into sobriety, it was exactly what he did. His approach was to tell them that he'd had this great epiphany, this magnificent spiritual experience, and that they needed to do so too. It was kind of like preaching at them. Get on your knees, fella, and start praying. And he found that didn't work at all. And he talks here about spiritual cocksureness, pride, and aggression. The aggressive approach, spiritual approach. And this article deals with that and tries to show us how we need to approach, especially the newcomer, on this whole question of spirituality and our own spirituality and growth of our spirituality. Let's go to the top of page 253. He's been talking about the aggressive approach which scares people off, and rightly so, because the whole trick here, if you want to call it a trick, is for us to share our experience and not to preach and not to rant and rave and not to show aggressiveness and not to show a closed-mindedness. Fortunately, it says, for such aggression in the name of spirituality isn't often seen nowadays. Yet this sorry and unusual episode can be turned to good account. We can ask ourselves whether, in the less obvious but nevertheless destructive forms, we are not more subject to fits of spiritual pride than we had supposed. If constantly worked at, I'm sure that no kind of self-survey could be more beneficial. Nothing could more surely increase our communication with each other and with God. Now, I read this to be a plea to you and me to inventory our own approach to others on the subject of spirituality. I'd like to suggest to you that the big book and the 12 steps are real clear on how this works if we do it right. First of all, we will tell the newcomer how we recovered, and it tells us to stress the spiritual freely. But this is our spiritual growth and our spiritual experience. Remember in Bill's story, Bill was told by Evie, all that's necessary is for you to form your own conception of God. There is no AA God. And we don't ask you to memorize a catechism or pass a spiritual test of any kind or a religious test. You're free to choose your own conception of God. But also, even though you are now an unbeliever, it's only necessary that you be willing to believe, and that's where it all starts. So this avoids, you see, all of the pitfalls of saying, if you don't believe as I believe, you will drink again. Well, that's not true. That's not true. What we talk about then is what we did. Here's what I did, and that's what the big book talks about. It tells us what they did, precisely what they did, to come to a spiritual awakening, because it's in the action. Everything in this program has to do with the actions we take. None of it has to do with memorizing some philosophy or some religious concept. It all has to do with taking action, seeking God. And so we can ask ourselves whether, in less obvious but nevertheless destructive forms, we are not more subject to fits of spiritual pride than we had supposed. So he's asking us to look to see how we act, what are our motives, and how do we approach the newcomer. Many years ago, a so-called unbeliever brought me to see this very clearly. He was an MD and a fine one. I met him and his wife Mary at the home of a friend in a Midwestern city. It was a purely social evening. Our fellowship of alcoholics was my sole topic, and I pretty much monopolized the conversation. Nevertheless, the doctor and his lady seemed truly interested, and he asked many questions. But one of them made me suspect that he was an agnostic, or maybe an atheist. This promptly triggered me, and I set out to convert him, then and there. Deadly serious, I actually bragged about my spectacular spiritual experience of the year before. The doctor mildly wondered if that experience might not be something other than I thought it was. This hit me hard, and I was downright rude. There had been no real provocation. The doctor was uniformly courteous, good-humored, and even respectful. Not a little wistfully, he said he often wished he had a firm faith, too, but plainly enough, I had convinced him of nothing. 3 years later, I revisited my Midwestern friend. Mary, the doctor's wife, came by for a call, and I learned that he had died the week before. Much affected, she began to speak of him. His was a noted Boston family. He'd been Harvard educated. A brilliant student, he might have gone on to fame in his profession. He could have enjoyed a wealthy practice and a social life among old friends. Instead, he insisted on being a company doctor in what was a strife-torn industrial town. When Mary had sometimes asked why they didn't go back to Boston, he would take her hand and say, "Maybe you're right, but I can't bring myself to leave. I think the people at the company really need me." Mary then recalled she had never known her husband to complain seriously about anything or to criticize anyone bitterly. Though he appeared to be perfectly well, the doctor showed slowed down in his last 5 years. When Mary prodded him to go out evenings and tried to get to the office on time, he always came up with a plausible and good-natured excuse. Not until his last illness did she know that all this